Art Mears started mapping avalanches in the mid-70s for the Colorado Geological Survey, and he's continued around the United States and around the world ever since. He's probably more responsible for municipal red and blue zones than any single person that's around today. Please welcome Art Mears.
Thanks, Ethan. I'd like to thank up front the Colorado Avalanche Information Center for inviting me to appear this morning. And when Ethan Green said in the end of our conversation earlier this summer, you can talk about anything you want, it was an invitation I couldn't resist to follow through on. But I decided the best thing to talk about really would be my perspectives on the avalanches of March of this year, because they were, from my perspective, unprecedented in my experience. So I'll be talking about several items, and I'll be freely speculating, because unlike the background that we have in Europe with extensive instrumentation, well funded, we basically have to deduce what's happened by observations of what has occurred in the vegetation and in the terrain. So I'll be walking us through how is this activated? I'll be walking through our observations. I'll be making some speculations on the release of these avalanches, which I think was fairly unusual for Colorado. We'll be discussing the motion of the avalanches and its destructive effects. These will be the topics I'll be discussing briefly, and I would like to point out that these are basically, they're my ideas. They're supported, I think, fairly strongly by research that's been done in Europe, but they're fundamentally what I have been able to deduce from the observations that I've made in the last few months. We'll start with an avalanche in central Colorado that illustrates some of the points that I wanted to make. This is the Avery Peak avalanches north of Gothic. It ran as a R5D4 avalanche, fairly large volume. It ran out into the valley bottom, extending farther than it ever has before, and particularly removed a tremendous amount of vegetation for the path. I can remember going up the road to our mountain cabin up there with my wife several times, and she would often say, well, why couldn't this avalanche run all the way over here? And I said, well, I just don't think the conditions will ever be right for it to be that big. This year, it did exactly that. It ran to its full extent, we think, and involved areas that hadn't been done before. And the reason for that, we have to consider what the release conditions were like during this storm slab of early March of this year. We had essentially, to sum it up, a maritime storm slab on top of a fairly strong Colorado snowpack. The storm slab bonded really well to the old snow down below, including the mid-pack layer that we usually trust as being fairly strong. When the slab released, the slab was strong enough, in some areas receiving about 30 centimeters of water equivalent, with a slab buildup of about 1.2 meters, meaning the average density of the storm slab was about 25%, or 250 kilograms per cubic meter. This is the average density of the whole storm slab. When this fractured, it released a tremendous amount of energy that enabled it to propagate very long distances. For example, in this case, it propagated completely around the top of this bedrock slab for a distance of 400 or 500 meters. When the avalanche released, it was strong enough, had a strong enough shock that it transmitted the shock down into the mid-pack layer, and in many cases released the mid-pack along with the storm slab. And this, I think, is an interesting characteristic that increased the volume of these paths tremendously. This is the latest idea. This is about 10 years old, but it hasn't evolved much since then, of what the internal structure of these large dry snow avalanches was like. And these were dry avalanches. Even though it was close to the freezing point, they were dry slab avalanches that even when they fell 600, 700, 800 meters, you still found blocks of snow laterally beyond the deposit. We normally think of the avalanche now, these large avalanches, as having a dense flow that consists of the density of the slab that released with particles and so forth in it. Over top of that, we have a fluidized or saltation layer in which we have blocks of snow and other debris that are transmitted several meters above the dense flow and do a lot of the impact damage. And above that, the suspension layer that hides everything else from view. That is a fairly low density and not as destructive. That's the general concept of the motion of these avalanches. And this illustrates what I'm talking about. It shows both the dense flow impact on a tree in here, which shows the lower 2 to 3 meters, a lot of scarring on this tree. But on this tree, you can see the saltation layer has affected almost the entire tree and broke the top off of it, even though this is well above the main flow of the avalanche. The saltation layer did this work. This was not the powder blast. This is a deep saltation layer that came down with the flow at high speeds. And the saltation layer might have a density of, around 10 to 50 kilograms per cubic meter, but it still contains blocks and is capable of doing a lot of damage. The width of the avalanche was impressive, and Brian just showed a picture of this photo. This is a photo by Chris Wilbur. This is taken at right angles to the avalanche flow across the area where this house was protected by a splitting wedge. It's about 300 meters across the avalanche flow. The width of it was about 300 meters. The flowing snow was split around the splitting wedge, and this was taken about a month after the avalanche occurred. The house was protected from the main force, but there was, inside the wedge, there was decorative trees, aspen trees and so forth that are all sheared off by the saltation layer. This overran the wedge and damaged the roof and parts of the house somewhat. The main force, the house was spared the main force of the avalanche by the wedge. A photo by Dan Morose of the 230 kV transmission line up Peru Creek. I don't know which aspect of the avalanche did the damage here, but several towers were basically damaged and the line was interrupted for a period of time, 20 days or something like that. I don't have the exact number. But this is up Peru Creek. Another interesting thing is when the deep flow came down, it ground into the facet layer at the bottom of the snowpack and ran basically at the ground level in parts of it, uprooting trees, extensive uprooting of trees. So we had, like, the large tree over on the left was broken off and transported a short distance. And on the right, there were craters, impact craters. The trees were removed, and the trees were transmitted some distance downslope. They were transported by the flow. So this happens particularly in wet snow avalanches, even in Colorado, but I've never seen anything as extensive as the events of this year, showing the very, very high energy of these avalanches per unit volume of the flow. Buildings, as Brian pointed out, some of them were completely destroyed. The sheriff's building, the sheriff's house in which his two daughters were sleeping, and the sheriff was sleeping, was completely destroyed. The people were not killed. One of them was thrown out of the building and landed 100 feet or so down slope. The house on the right was completely sheared off at foundation level from an avalanche that came from the right. The Limekilm, which we mentioned before, from Hinsdale County. The Limekilm was purchased by the Hinsdale Historical Society on the day the avalanche occurred. I remember the director was saying to me, well, I had a really bad feeling about doing this, but we got into this point where the opportunity to buy the structure. It's an historic structure. It was twice as tall as this. And the chimney was broken off, and it was on the register of historic sites, an important structure. And basically, there's no practical way to protect the historic site. And if you did that, it still wouldn't even be an historic site anymore. So I don't know what they're going to do on this one. An interesting feature of the avalanche was the shear in the lower part of the flow. This is taken 3 months after the avalanche occurred, so a lot has changed. But you can see from the two ski poles stuck in the snow there, it was about a 4 to 5 foot deep shear plane. Basically, as the avalanche moved through, it sheared as a rigid block and move down slope, leaving these clear shear plains. This is a feature you see commonly in big wet snow avalanches. But dry snow avalanches can produce the shear plains too when you've got a deep enough flow and high enough shear stresses at the boundaries. You can also develop shear plains in these dry flowing avalanches when they're big enough and deep enough. The volume of avalanches was impressive. As Brian has pointed out, we've documented at least 3 D5 avalanches. There probably were more. The destructive scale is somewhat arbitrary, but it's based on several criteria, and many of these avalanches satisfy at least 2 or 3 of the criteria to make them D5 avalanches. There's no question at all that we had some D5 avalanches in this cycle. Extension of the avalanche paths was impressive. On the left is an avalanche path in Henson Creek. It shows the width of the avalanche as it destroyed trees at the lateral boundaries of it compared to the normal flow down the main gully. And on the right, an extension of an avalanche path that we just visited a couple of weeks ago, where an avalanche extended into the forest. An interesting feature about these avalanches, and a very scary one, is the fact that the debris was carried uphill to the end of the runout limit in many cases. There was no damage, no discernible damage beyond the heavy debris and destructive characteristics of these flows. That it was heavy and destructive right to the end. So this suggests that there's a very narrow range of blue zone or area which is buildable. It was very impressive in that the force from the avalanche took debris almost all the way to the end of the runout. That's actually pretty scary from an engineering perspective, because you don't want people to build in the worst areas, but the worst areas extended almost to the very end. And that is something that we definitely have to consider in future work. So a summary of the release conditions then, we had, just summarize what I was just talking about, we had a strong, high-density storm slab, and that enabled long fractures, and these propagated because of their fractures into the mid-pack layer and developed bigger avalanches. We had modest winds that enabled relatively uniform loading in various exposures. You had avalanches falling from the opposite sides of the valley. The fractures released the mid-pack layer, in many cases adding to the volume. Looking at the dynamics again, once we should really think about it in sort of terms of 3 layers. A dense flow that plows into the snowpack and erodes it. A saltation layer that can be several meters above the dense flow, and was in this case, and then a suspension layer above it. And the destructive flow characteristics, we had that dense lower flow, which is very destructive right to the ground, sheared houses off, many uprooted trees and transported rocks, some rocks that were hard, that were impossible to move by hand, were deposited on roads and had to be moved by heavy equipment. We had the saltation layer above the dense flow, 5 or more meters thick. This stripped branches, it wasn't just the powder blast, but it was the saltation layer, and it was deep. And the avalanche had what we would call a very high energy density. By that I mean the amount of kinetic energy in the avalanche per unit of volume. And this translates to destructive potential. That is the end of my speculations on what happened this year. I thank you for your attention.
That was great. Thank you very much, Art. Are there any questions from the audience? Please raise your hand and we'll try to get a mic over to you.
So I'm curious if you've had any interface with the insurance industry at this point. I can't imagine what it would be like to insure that house, even with its nice wedge wall.
I'm not sure I heard your question completely, but I'm not sure I know either what it would have been like in that house.
I can tell you that most homeowner policies in Colorado, at least from the people we've talked to in this event, do not cover avalanches. Just like floods, you can get additional riders. We did talk to one homeowner who did have his home completely destroyed and was covered for avalanches. We haven't heard how that turned out.
Yeah, I guess I can make an additional comment about the insurance. Most homeowners policies don't worry about avalanches because it's such a rare problem. Most people are worried about the house burning down. And most homeowners policies cover that and cover other incidentals. In some cases, you can buy riders to cover certain things, not floods. Avalanches are automatically included in some policies and not in others.
Any other questions? This is your chance to talk to Art. Oh, there's one.
Can you comment at all about the, on, it was like March 6th, there's a really high rain line, at least in our zone, the Aspen area. Can you comment on how that played into the cycle?
Could you please ask your question again?
On March 6th, there was rain to about 10,000 feet in the Aspen zone. And so just wondering how that played into when you're discussing the storm slab, how that played into that.
No, I really have no more information on that. Sorry.
There's a question.
Do you think that after this winter, we're going to see larger avalanches in these newly new paths that have been created?
The best way I can answer that question is to quote something from Yogi Berra. He said, predictions are very difficult, especially about the future. So I don't know.
Spoken like someone who's been doing this for a long time. Are there any questions from the simulcast? No? Okay. Oh.
Were you able to look at some of the paths, and is it the alpha angle that we kind of talk about and look at sometimes, and how far some of these paths ran compared to some of the math that we use?
Some of the paths, many of the paths ran unusually long distances, but I can't think of any of these avalanches in Colorado that had really low alpha angles compared to some other avalanches. That's because in some cases in the past, we've considered the end of the powder blast in the alpha angle. In this case, I think the distinguishing characteristic about these paths is how far into the path it was destructive, almost right to the end. So regardless of the alpha angle, the destruction extent was very unusually far in this case.
We have a question over here, Art.
You mentioned at the beginning that in Europe they have technology that they're able to assess the damage in different ways rather than looking at the vegetative damage after the fact. What kind of technology is that?
Could you ask your question again, please?
Yeah, you mentioned at the beginning that in Europe they have some kinds of technologies to assess the damage in different ways. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, in Europe, in some of their large experiments, in Switzerland and Norway, for example, and maybe in other cases as well, they have expensive instrumentation set up to monitor the speed fluctuations and density fluctuations in moving avalanches. They're very expensive. The difference is that in some of these foreign countries, avalanches are a national problem. In the United States, our national problems are hurricanes, tornadoes, or other things. We have avalanche problems, but we just don't have the funding that's available to set up this expensive instrumentation.
Can we take one more?
There's a question in the back.
So in some of the larger D4, D5 avalanches, can you comment, was there any changes to actual, the ground or earth? Like, you know, were hills sheared off or anything like that? You talked about some rocks that had been moved. Any other information about the larger paths that ran last spring?
Did you hear that?
No.
So the question was about gouging of the earth. Places where there were more than just rocks moves, but actual changes to the land surface.
Yeah, in places there was some gouging of the earth, as well as transport of rocks. There was gouging of the earth essentially where these trees were uprooted and transported, because the uprooting of the trees exposed rocks, and the rocks were then transported downslope. So there definitely was gouging of the earth as this dense flowing layer plowed into the facets we had on the ground and ran on the ground. So yes, there was some gouging of the earth in this case as well.
I'll just throw my 2 cents. There were places where we found rock buttresses that were, especially narrow gullies at the bottom of big paths that had gotten blown out. There was one path in the Hinsdale County area off County Road 30 where there was a tremendous amount of talus moved. I think thousands of tons would probably be an understatement. We were looking at that event a little bit more closely, but there was a flash flood mudslide event in that same path later this summer, which changed it again.
Yep. Well, I'd like to end by saying that I theoretically, I knew a lot of these things could happen, but I never believed I would actually see it happen. So I'm fortunate.
That's maybe a very good place to end. Great perspective. Thanks, Art.